Cheers, Gerald. Hello and welcome, everyone. So in the next couple of minutes, we'll be talking about authentication in your mobile app, the logins, the handling credentials, improving some user experience, and also the logouts, which I figured out was more important than I initially thought. But yes, authentication, I mean, how hard can this actually be? I mean, isn't it just like entering your username and password, hitting a login, and then you're on with your merry way? That's at least how I, a very, very long time, thought this is authentication. And I have learned over the time that it can be a bit different. And you also have to take in a bit of a different perspective than maybe just the pure mobile developer view. So I think I always like to start with the question like, why do we even need this? Because maybe we don't need it, then we can just remove it. Turns out we probably need authentication though. So let's just think you've got a business service in the back end that has got some valuable information, some valuable services to you. And in most cases, you don't want that everybody can have access to that. So you want to have people, identities that you can trust. And usually you use for that an identity service. And once you have that, you then connect your business service to that. And they say, hey, people that have been verified by this identity service, I'll trust them, I'll provide them services. And so if we have now a mobile app coming into the game, and we'll be doing this later on. So what we do is we authenticate, we get back some signed thingy, which we then can present and make an authenticated request, and then the server will give us the response. Now, when looking at this, it's quite important that you have like the right mindset going on, because when you think about authentication, you're usually not thinking about the clients. You're thinking about the back end. So the back end is the safe place, okay? The servers, you control them. Let's just assume no one can break into them. I mean, sure, that could also happen, but usually it's a more trusted environment than just someone's mobile phone, which they might lose. I mean, God help, they might even hand it over to a friend unlocked and they could do whatever, okay? So back end, safe harboring place. Front ends, well, we have to worry a bit about them. They're not really trustworthy, at least when we talk about authentication. Sorry, your beloved app actually falls kind of in that category when you put on a tinfoil hat. Now, what should we take for choosing this authentication standard? And one that is very widely used these days is actually OAuth. OAuth allows you to have a central instance for identity service, which users then can log into. They get credentials back, we call them tokens, and then we can go to a service that trusts our identity service using OAuth, and we can then access them. So the images that we just saw before, we can do that. And you can also, OAuth also enables these scenarios where you log in to Google, and then Google actually does the whole authentication part, and then you can just use your web service, which then actually accepts authentication from Google or Microsoft or Facebook or Twitter or GitHub. I mean, probably we've all used services where we don't create a new account, we just use an existing one. This is also a scenario that OAuth actually provides. Now, OAuth has got one tiny flaw. When it does the entire authentication and we get back a token verifying that we have authenticated properly, we have no idea who we are. I mean, that was a bit of a problem. So great, we can now access it. But who are you? And should you be able to access this resource as you, or are you trying to impersonate someone? That's kind of not handled in the OAuth standard. And then people started cobbling stuff around and putting stuff into these tokens and whatnot. But there was no real standard. And then a new standard came along, and that's OpenID Connect. So when you look around OAuth, you will often also see OpenID Connect. And I initially thought, so new standard, so OAuth is not good, but it actually turns out they work together. So this is not a new authentication mechanism. It's just an addition to OAuth so that we actually know who we are. And we'll have a look at that later on. But that's like the big picture. So we use OAuth to authenticate, we use OpenID Connect, which is attached to it, and that's usually backend stuff. So I'll be assuming someone already did the entire work for the server, and we now create a client that actually has to interact with it. And we'll be using, of course, a mobile client. Now, when you are looking at authenticating someone, OAuth presents you with something called flows. And there are multiple flows, and that can be a bit confusing at first. Now, there are 4 major flows, in OAuth, and we'll be picking the authorization code grant flow. I'll get back to the other flows a bit later on. And what this actually does is, this is like the secure way or the recommended way how you authenticate a user using a mobile application. This flow was, so to speak, specifically designed for mobile scenarios, though you can also use it in different kinds, like desktop applications and stuff like that. How does this flow look like? Well, it's actually quite easy. Everything is a bit confusing when it comes to authentication. So what we do is we create a authentication request in a browser on the server. So we don't do this in a client. So we don't have a view that we program with XAML and Xamarin.Forms, which we then use to authenticate a user. We open up a browser, which is hosted actually on the identity services server. And that service then returns an authorization code, kind of a deep link. We'll go into that again. And then with that code, we can then request the tokens, and then we get the tokens, and then we can finally make our requests to the backend. I can not only make one request, as it's shown on this diagram, I can make multiple requests just as long as the token is valid. So starting out in our code, actually, there are two NuGet packages which I would recommend, or which I'm using here, and it's the identity model and the identity model OIDC client, OpenID Connect client. And there's a third package involved, but we get it kind of per default, so we sometimes forget about it, Xamarin Essentials. So with these three packages up to date and ready to go on the latest Xamarin.Forms standard, all shown there, we can now start to implement our OAuth. And OAuth has got some configuration options which we have to do. The OIDC client provides us with a lot of helpers around these things. And what we see here is how we can configure said clients to then make all these requests and responses that we just saw before. So what we have here is we have the authority, which is the URL to the backend, so where the identity service is running right now. We have a client ID. Now, in an identity service, you can have multiple clients. We could have a mobile client, we could have a web client, an IoT client, something somewhat client. Maybe we even have multiple mobile clients. So this is just a name that we define on the server. And then we have scopes. I'll get to those in a bit. We have a redirect URL. So because we're calling out to the server, we have to also tell the server how to get back to us once we have authenticated properly, which is there. There's also the option of a client secret. Now, client secrets can be used in a different flow. I'll get back to that at the end of the presentation. It's basically, it could be a GUID, it could be a certificate, which we then attach to our request. Now, maybe you have already seen the talk by Kerry Lothrop, who explains in quite detail why anything that you put into a mobile app is not really safe. So it's optional, you can put it in there. It might add a little layer, additional layer of security, but it's not really required for our flow that we're using. So you can put something in there. You could write, "Hi, XamExpertDay," or just put in some GUID, or just leave it null. And then there comes the browser. We'll get to that in a bit. That's where we then make our actual web request out to the server. And with that, we can then create our OIDC client and make requests with that. Now, an important thing, even though it looks so sweet, small, and harmless, is the configurations that you just saw on the screen before have to match with the configurations done on the server. Otherwise, this can get really frustrating really quickly. I said before, we'd be making a browser request, and that's a bit of code that we still have to implement. So that's not out of the box ready to go. So let's look at how we can implement said browser. This is actually the entire code you will need to do this. And what we do is we implement a class. I call it Web Authenticator Browser. You can call it whatever you want. And we inherit from iBrowser, which is an interface provided by the OIDC client NuGet package. We have to implement one method. It's the invoke async method. And in there, we get passed in the browser options and also a cancellation token, which I'm not using properly in the code below because I wanted to keep the code readable. So what we do is when we do the web authentication, we have to give with a start URL and a callback URL. They're both provided in the browser options. They are passed in from the configurations that we did before. So we can now, when we call this method. We'll pass in, hey, there's my identity service, and it will handle the web request. We're just doing basic HTTP requests over a secure channel. But it's all taken. There's some ceremony behind it to make it a bit more safe, and to make sure that man-in-the-middle attacks cannot be taken or not be made. So this is the basic setup. So now when we invoke this, when we now say web authenticator authenticate async, what we now actually do is, when we look at the big picture, is we make now this web request. So we open up a browser on our mobile device, and then we enter in the credentials. And then we get back this code. And this code will be a deep link back into our app. Now, what we have to do is we have to now inform the operating system, hey, when you get a request back from a device, or a deep link back call from that, please open me up. We have to do that. And so how do we handle this callback? We have to do it for Android and iOS. And thankfully, we can get some help from the Xamarin Essentials package. So let's look at iOS first. So in here, we open up the info plist file. And sometimes it's easier to look at this in the XML when you type it in the first time. It's also easy to copy and paste the stuff over. I'll provide some samples for this. And in here, we can define the URL types and the schemes that we're using to making this authentication. You can see down here, this is the callback string that I'm adding. And this exact callback string is also defined again on the server. So these things that always have to match, they're case sensitive. I know usually URLs aren't. In authentication spaces, they are. And with this, we have registered ourselves by iOS. Now, the last thing that we still have to do is in the app delegate, we still have to write in two methods, the open URL and the continue user activity. All these things are actually really nicely documented on the Microsoft Docs page. It's just knowing how to put all the bits together, which can add up over time. The next thing that we have to do is Android. Now in Android, we have the Android manifest XML file. And in here, we have to add this intent, this action. And with that, we will then be able to get the callback. After this, you still have to implement a additional activity. Sorry. We have to add an additional activity. Most of this stuff is actually also in the docs. One thing I would like to point out is this data scheme. Now, in here, you put in the callback URL, the one that we previously defined in the info plist for iOS. And if you're working on different environments, this can be a bit tricky because you actually have to provide the entire URL to put in there. And when you have different callbacks for different environments, because you've got multiple apps installed for all your dev, staging, and prod environments, you usually don't want that the authentication app from production starts opening up your dev app and fun stuff like that. So what I usually end up doing is I put it as a static const variable in my appsaml.cs, and then with the ifdef precompiled flags, you can then switch between what callback you want. But since this is in an attribute, you can't just have like some JSON configuration file lying around and loading it up at runtime. That will not work here. So yeah, that might still be a bit of a brain scratcher there. So what we now have done with all this configuration is we have now implemented the code to start up the web browser. Then the user will enter his credentials on the website of the identity service, and then we handle the callback into the code. So before we were in the iBrowser implementation, we skipped out of there to have a look at that. So let's get back into there. So we have now made our request. We now assume that the auth result was positive. And what we now have to do is to make the next call, we have to sort of format this call going out. And that call going out, we do here. So what we get is like a code. And with that, we have to make an additional request to get the token. Mainly a security thing that we don't pass in the token, because the token would then stand in the URL that would be passing into the device. And that is not really secure because you can't really encrypt the URL. Otherwise, no one knows what you're trying to call. So this is what I'm doing here. I'm making a URL. I'm just stitching together these key value pairs. And then I will create a browser result. Again, this is something from the OIDC client, and I'll pass that back. And this is a piece of code that will be executed in between OIDC standard code. So what we are doing here is we are creating a new web browser because the library does not provide a default implementation for Xamarin.Forms at the time. And this is how it will then look when we create it. So first, we create our OIDC client. That's where we have all our options. Then we invoke the OIDC login async with a new login request. And in that request, our browser will then be invoked. So the browser will open, and then automatically the token request will be made, and we'll get some tokens. So let's have a look how this actually looks when we are doing this in code. So I have here my run-of-the-mill Xamarin.Forms application. And what I now want to do is I want to make a login. So I have here my main view model, and I put here a breakpoint, and I'll just start this up. So this is a button that is called login. And with that button, I will then start this authentication flow, which I've just shown you before. So I now push this button. You can see I'm now in this code, and I can now look at the OIDC service, which will be called back here. And here I would then call the authenticate method. So I'll just step further. We have now created our clients in here with all the attributes that you have seen before in the code. So we have here our authority URL, and we have some additional, we have the redirect URL, which will then be called once everything is completed, and we see down here the scope. So all this stuff is already prearranged, and now I can do this once more. Now this takes probably a bit of time because I was in the preview session and I didn't start this demo, so the Azure Web Service had to start up. I then have to always click away this nice dialogue. I haven't found yet a way to get rid of that. And what we're now doing is we are now in the iBrowser interface. So this is now the web browser that's been started up. And you can see I have here my options that have been passed in as before. I have the end URL, the callback, I have the start URL. There's some stuff going on here. This is the added security that we would have to do our own, but there's a NuGet package doing that for us. So what I now can do is I can now step further, and I should now already be logged in because I forgot to log out. Oh, that's fun. So let's just guess I had to enter my credentials. I'll get back to this phenomenon in a second, why this actually happened. But you can see I'm now logged in. I had to open up a web browser session. The credentials were then posted back in. I then got a token, and now I got some valid credentials, as you can see here. So, recap. The OAuth OIDC setup, it can be a bit confusing the first time you do go through it, but there are actually a lot of steps that are taken care of. So if you use Xamarin Essentials and the OIDC client, there are some small steps we still have to do, some configuration steps. I mean, yeah, there was some code involved with the iBrowser, but the rest is mainly configuring the web request, like knowing which URL you're using, and still some configurations concerns of OAuth. Now, the nice thing about when you do it in this way, the app actually never knows the user credentials. The app never sees the username and password. And this is nice out of a security perspective, because this means no app ever gets to know them. I mean, we could say, hey, I'm a fair player, I will never store the username and password. But with this flow, it's not up to the client if he wants to forget about the credentials. It's like baked into the flow. And from a security perspective, that's a good thing. And just to mention it once more, the right configuration is essential. This is a picture of me doing it the first time, screaming at my computer why this is not correct. And I put all in the right configurations and I said before, case sensitivity can play a role. So this might have led up to this picture. But yeah, if you get one little thing wrong in that configuration, you'll just get, nah, not interested in that today. And then we'll move on. So we have now gotten tokens. So what now? Well, now the fun time actually begins. Usually what you will do is a lot of web requests with using the HTTP client. So you can add the default request headers authorization. You can add the authentication header value to it, and then just use bearer and then have the access token put in there. If you set it to null, this will not be sent when making an HTTP request. So if you are not logged in, you could just have that to null, and the attribute will not show up in a request. So that's something really nice. Another thing that you often want to do is store the token, because you might need it later on, or the user closes the app and you wanted to make another request, and you can do that. Now, I would recommend you use storage with some Xamarin Essentials, because that will really easily allow you to store these tokens securely, so that they also will be stored in an encrypted fashion. So if the phone gets stolen and unlocked and stuff like that, you will make it a lot harder to retrieve those credential bits that you then have. Now, another thing that we can actually do is OpenID Connect. So I said before, the authentication token does not really provide any information about the user, and you can actually pack in quite a bit of stuff. Now, let me show you what I mean by that. Now, I have here my application, and when we get when the web request returns, we get actually more than one token back. So what we get is we get an ID token, we get an access token, and in a bit, we'll look at a third token that we will get. And the ID token that we have here, I'll copy it into my buffer, is actually the result, we can say, from the request that we just made. Now, you can either go to jwt.ms and paste it into here. And now what you can see is this is actually part of the token. So we have a header part up here. This is actually the interesting part that we have here. So in here, I have quite a little bit of information. I see what my client is. I can see who provided this. I also got when it expires, stuff like that. But if you can add additional information to here. So if you're using a service like Microsoft Graph, you can put additional user information into here. So that means whenever you make a web request, the server can also read it. And since everything is signed by the identity instance, if something is getting altered, the server will know that this is not anymore a valid token. So I can put my user ID in here, make web requests, and then on the server use that user ID and know this is not being tampered with. This is not someone trying to give himself out as Gerald and then uploading dance videos of Gerald on YouTube. Though we might want to do that at some point. Maybe not today, some other day. Another really cool service that I sometimes use is jwt.io. And the reason why is it's a lot easier. You got here's some nice helpers. So if I zoom into here, I hope you can still see it. You can actually see when this token expires. So this token expires at 10:40 GMT +2. So essentially it'll be in summertime. Helps even out with those pesky time zones. So you can see this token is actually not valid for a very long time, is it? It's only valid for about 1 or 2 hours. And that's the default that we get when using these tokens. Another thing, I'll just do this once. I can actually even copy the access token because it looks quite familiar. And I could also paste it into here. And you will see there's a lot of, it looks quite similar, doesn't it? But you shouldn't do this. So it's not that you can't do it. You could actually pass this in code because it's also JWT, but there's no guarantee that the access token in OAuth will actually be a JWT token. So even though it looks very similar, usually you would not use the access token to retrieve information because it's not really guaranteed by the server that this might not change at some later time. Okay, so that is what you can do with the tokens. And I think mainly what you will be doing is getting some information out of it and using it to get access to some HTTP API. So the ID token contains information about the OAuth token, and the ID token contains also information about the user. I haven't put really a lot of information about the user in this token. It's mainly the default token that you get by the identity server, which I'm using in the backend, but I could do it. I could add additional information, which can be really useful when using it later on. And again, just use the ID token, not the auth token, to retrieve information because it's a bit frowned upon to do that. Or better said, the standard does not guarantee that your app might not break at some point because the server doesn't really have to follow along the rules to keep it a JWT. So we saw it before. The token is valid for 1 hour, and then you go well, it gets renewed, right? I mean, I have to log in every couple of hours, I hope. And well, it turns out, well, yes, you would have to. You would have to actually authenticate every time that token expires, and it's quite a short time frame. Now, we could, of course, bump up the token access, but that, you might have guessed it, is a bit of a security concern. So there is a different way how we can do that using OAuth, and that's refreshing your tokens. Now, when we look at the OIDC client options, which we used at the beginning, the scope. So in the scope, we say, I would like to have access to certain properties. You could add additional properties in here. You can use scopes for scoping in your API usage that you want, or also for requesting access, as I said before, like from a graph API type of service that would then give you these things. These scopes, they have to match with the backend. But what I now could do is I can add the offline access. And offline access means I can request a new token without the user having to request a new token every time. And just to mention it once more, because I can't tell you how many hours of my life I've lost to this thing, it's really important that the server is also configured to enable this offline access thing. So what we now can do is, I'll hop over quick to the code, and I have in here in my identity service, I have down here, I have my refresh token going on. And I'll just set a breakpoint right here. And I have here this button, which will eventually invoke this method. And when we come in here, we create a new OIDC client, same method as before. And then I will just quickly step further to the next one. And we can now see I have now gotten a response from the refresh token. So what I've got a fresh access token. I've got again an identity token. And you can see here, I got a new refresh token. Now, refresh tokens, they expire about every month. It's again a setting on the server, and we can't read this. You can see this does not look like some JWT token up there. So you would just have to know how long it is valid. But with this, you can request a new access token. And if I now just remove these breakpoints here and continue letting them run, if we look up here at the time, if I do this once more, we can see the time is always jumping forward. So I'm always getting a new token based on the time zone or based on how long that it will be valid. And this is a really nice way, because usually you wouldn't have a button in your UI and then say, hey, please refresh, please refresh. But you can do that in the background. So every time your app starts, you could get the information from the ID token, hey, when will my access token expire? And then you could refresh it. Or you could make a request with the access token, and then you will get a response that this is an expired token, and then you could make the refresh. So there are two ways how you can do it. You can be a bit quicker with just enforcing the refresh on your own, or a bit smarter if you want, or you can just let the server handle that for you. Now, this is how you can refresh these things, and that's how you can actually let your user be locked in. So from a UX perspective, this is really nice, because before I would have had to enter the login each and every time the app has been a couple of hours running. And I don't think you know of many apps that have got a great rating in the App Store that provide this model of security. So refresh tokens allow you to automatically log in the user again once he has provided initially his credentials. Usually once there's this refresh token is something you don't want to let be stolen, because even though it expires usually at the first time you make the request, it's valid for quite a long time. So it can be 1 month, it can be 3 months. It's usually a bit of a business decision how often the app gets used and when you want to cut it. And this can be very, what shall I say? I was using this approach once with a customer where the users of the app, it was an enterprise app, they didn't always have the best internet connection when they were doing this. And this just ended up in them having to authenticate a lot of times. And there is a setting that you can say, hey, a refresh token can be used for multiple refreshes. But that, again, is from a security perspective, it can be difficult, because suddenly people could use your refresh token over and over if they ever get a hold of it. And they always get a fresh refresh token when the request was good. What you can do with a refresh token is you can actually block it on the identity service So you can say, hey, my phone got stolen, something like that, or forget my device. You might have seen that when you use like your Apple or Microsoft accounts. You can say forget this device. This means the refresh token that is associated to that device will then be forgotten on the identity service, and then it will no longer be valid to get new tokens. Now, one topic I never thought would be that important when doing anything was actually logging out. Now, I always thought the only concern that people have is staying logged in, but it turns out there are some use case scenarios when people share a device, so you want them actually to log out and then log in again. And I thought, hey, Mark, you're smart. This is actually quite easy. You just forget about your tokens, set them to null, and reset the default request setter authorization, and all is good, right? So I did that. So I was logged in, I pressed logged out, and then this happens. And you saw this just happening before when I initially tried to log in, and that was a bit strange. So I then had to dig a bit deep, and then I thought, well, why was this happening? And it turns out, since we are now using actually a web browser in the backend, it's not only the app that knows that we are logged in. So what we have to do is we have to somehow tell that web browser or the backend service that we actually want to log out. So please let the web session expire on our client. And to do this, we can add a post-logout redirect URL. So again, we will be calling the backend server for this. We'll be opening up another browser session for this. It's just one more option. We don't have to make a new client for this. This is, again, an addition that we can make. And on Apple, what we have to do is we will also have to enter this URL scheme in here so that it can then again call back. On Android, we don't have to do this because we only give in the first part of the URI. It's not interested in what comes after the slash, which is passed through. But we are interested in, on iOS, we have to actually register this specifically. So it turns out it's a bit more complex, so we have to do a bit more logic. So again, this might be something for the identity service. So again, we go in there, we delete the tokens, and we reset the authentication header. And then we make a new OIDC client, and we then create a logout request, and this will then terminate the session. Now, it is quite, one thing that I want to point out to is you want to add the ID token hint. So this is the identity token, the ID token. You will pass that with to the logout request. This is made that you will not spoof another app, because when you do this, you will just log out the web session, and this could be used for spoofing so that somebody might no longer be able to access the web application. And when we do this, you can now see, and I have to add I have to now log in again. So this is how we then have to, this now works actually properly. But there are some additional steps that I first didn't think about. So this is logout. And what we've seen is that because we're using the code flow, it creates a web session. And that web session is not in our app. It's actually on the operating system. So that's why we have to, again, open up quickly the browser. You saw it there maybe before, quickly running through. It popped up, and it just went straight away, again, away, so that the web session is closed. Then don't forget to delete the tokens in the app. A authentication token is actually valid for 1 or 2 hours, and it will always be valid for those 2 hours. So if I go to the identity service and I delete the user, and I still have a valid token, I can still make requests to the data APIs because they trust that the token that was granted by that service is actually still valid. So if I have a token which is valid for 5 years, and then I quit my job, I still have my token to access multiple backend services for 5 years because it's a valid piece. It's like the COVID certificate, if you want to say so. It's valid as long as it's valid, and it can't be revoked because it's kind of, there's no check going on between the backend logic and the authentication service. Now that's why you also want to delete it out of your auth header. If you get one of those, you will be locked out, but your app will still be able to make those requests, and then you will probably get some funky experiences going on in your testing sessions, or if you didn't test for them in real life. So we went from username and password entry to this, right? Pretty much, more or less. And some of you might now go like, is it really worth doing all this? I mean, we had to set up an OIDC client, we had to set up callback algorithms, and then we had to handle tokens, and we had the refresh token thing going on. And oh my God, I mean, not even Logout works super simple. You actually have to do some additional steps there. And yeah, it is quite a few steps that we have to undertake to implement OAuth in a mobile app. I will not kid you there. And it's also a bit complex to do it. And the thought might come up, well, why do we do this? And I think the main reason is it's just identity services are not just there for mobile. I mean, you could do a HTTP basic authentication where you send your username and password with every request to the server. But that means that every client that contacts that API can do that. So a potential hacker could actually try brute forcing his way into your backend API. And having to use a token just is a lot more complex and makes this approach no longer feasible. So that's why this token-based approach came along. And then also seeing the client as an attack vector has become more and more reality. I mean, I've just received an email this week from my supposed CEO that he has got an urgent task that he would like to discuss with me. Two problems. One, it was full with typos, and two, he usually doesn't talk in English with me. So, but that could happen. And I mean, it's harder to create a fake mobile app. I give you that, but it still could be possible. And that's the scenario why these authentication mechanisms are so, maybe a bit blown up. But we have many attack vectors these days, and this is what we're trying to prevent when using this. Plus, once it's running, you can go again back to the fun bits, creating nice UIs and providing some cool user value. Now, before we leave, OAuth actually provides more than just mobile stuff. I said it before, and they're also more than one flow that we can go through. Now, I just want to give you quick an overview. Once you've gone through the trouble of making an identity service, what you could actually do with it. So the client credential grant is the client secret that I talked before with the options. And what you can now do, this is a scenario, let's say, for IoT devices. So you trust the device because you manufacture it. It's not like someone goes into a shop, buys it, downloads your app from the store, and they somehow can also get to the contents of the app, but because you put it like on the chip, right? You burn it right in there in the factory. You can put a certificate in there, which you then use to communicate with the backend. So that could be one way how you could provide that service. And we could also use this in a mobile app. So we could do this. There's nothing preventing us from doing this. It's just the secret is quite easy to get to once you're in your mobile app. But maybe you have a scenario where you say, but Mark, I just have a tablet somewhere installed in a wall. No one can access it. And it's just there for, I don't know, an information kiosk. You could also do this. You could set up a client which has got read-only access. It's got a certificate and it makes the request. And you could totally do these kind of scenarios. The next one, which is not only quite a mouthful, the code resource on a password credential grant flow, is what you would expect. No, it doesn't. What you do here is you enter a username and password and you actually get back a token from the service, which some of you might think, I thought we would do that from the start. Thing is, this thing is there for legacy applications. So the reason why you don't want to do this, I said it before, is you don't actually want the client app to ever see the username and password. So that's why we use a safe application, the browser, which is provided from the operating system, which is, sign and whatnot. So there's little tampering, so we can be kind of sure that there's no tampering going on there. I mean, nothing is 100% secure, but yeah, it makes it a lot more difficult. With this, we can actually circumvent that. We could actually make a user dialog. We could have Stephen create the nicest one, or maybe even Kim, like some nice animations going on and all that. And I think it would be looking really awesome. And we could do that. But again, it's not really so secure. And then we have the authorization code grant, which is the one that I just showed you before. The implicit code grant is when you use a SPA, a single page web application, you would use the implicit code grant. So those are also there. Now, I just want to stress this point. The code resource owner password credential grant might look really nice to the developer. It might not just be the developer, it might also be the business manager, but security best practices say like, nah, maybe not the best idea. Plus, in an upcoming version, which will be OAuth 2.1, they're actually looking at even removing that flow from the standard. That's many years out, so I'm not saying if you do it today, you would have to warn your customers that, hey, next year, this will not work anymore. Plus, if you own the server, you could also control that. But it's just, this flow is so insecure, it's being considered to be removed from the standard. Just to let you know. Now, another thing that you might want to know is like who actually even uses this OAuth thingy. And well, this is like these three. Now, there's actually a lot more companies that are using it. You might have seen, like when you log into Microsoft Office or Outlook, or even Visual Studio, you're always greeted with the same login dialog. And that is mainly because they always use the same identity service in the background to authenticate you. The same is true for Google, and Facebook also uses it, and a lot more companies also use it. I think I could have just filled this slide with company icons, which are actually using OAuth. So it's really widespread, and it has proven that it's secure in some fashion, unless you get a crowbar and force users to tell the password. But that's another thing. Now, since we are here in a soon-to-be Maui world, and what about Maui? How will the changes be? And I hope I could show you that. There are very few touching points that probably will change when it comes to Maui. I mean, Xamarin Essentials is being migrated over to Maui. The OIDC client is already .NET Standard 2.0. So these things, they will work on. And I have some blog posts all about these things. And I'm looking forward to just copy and pasting them, replacing Xamarin.Forms with Maui, and then more or less have a working new blog post. Might have to do some more work. But yeah, you get the point. I think it will be quite easy to do. So some takeaways. I'm running out of time here, and I know that the next session will be really cool. I'm looking forward to that one too. So OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect are an industry-wide standard, so I think they're really cool to be trusted. If you don't know the password, you can't lose it. So I think that's a good thing. And yeah, with Xamarin Essentials OIDC client NuGet packages, you basically are set to go. And that's about it for me. Sorry, I'll check later the chat if there have been any questions. My name is Mark Allibone, though Tobias said I don't really have to say that. You can find me on Twitter. I have a blog post. I have a blog on allibone.com. I also do a podcast with my good friends Stephen and Gerald. And I will be later uploading all the code samples and the slides stuff also under this. If you now click on that URL or you type it in, it will be empty. But yeah, it will be there soon. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for attending my talk.
Awesome, Mark. Thank you so much for giving your talk. I think there were definitely some questions in, so maybe let's just take one. There was some questions in the chat. I think there was a couple of people who were interested in, does this also all work for UWP?
Yes. It does. I haven't done it because I'm mainly working on Mac, but if you look at the samples that are on the Xamarin Essentials, which is also, so a lot of the touch points are actually done with Xamarin Essentials when you have to go back into the app, and Xamarin Essentials provides those. So yeah, you should be good to go.
Like you said, it's kind of like technology, even technology agnostic, right? So you can use it in all the things as long as you follow the flow and as long as you can implement HTTP calls, basically, you're good to go.
Yeah, you can also do it all on your own. So there's,
All right, perfect. Again, thanks so much, Mark. We're already going a little bit over time because, well, you were spot on. But I'm thanking you for your time. You can find all the things on the repository that was just mentioned.